The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle, but inside the private quarters, darkness seemed to have settled permanently. William sat at the edge of his bed, his hands trembling slightly as he stared at his phone. The message from his private secretary had arrived at 4:47 a.m. Though he had been awake for hours already, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kate found him there when she emerged from the bathroom, her face still puffy from the restless sleep they had both endured. She had sensed it too, that heavy feeling that had been building for weeks. The Queen had been declining, yes, but she had always seemed invincible, immortal almost. Even at 96, Elizabeth II had possessed a strength that defied her age. "The doctors say it's a matter of hours," William whispered, his voice breaking slightly on the last word. Kate moved to sit beside him, her hand finding his without hesitation. They had faced many challenges together, but nothing had prepared them for this moment. The drive to Balmoral felt endless. Catherine watched the Scottish countryside blur past the windows of their car, her mind racing with memories of family gatherings at the Queen's beloved castle. She remembered the children's laughter echoing through the halls during their last visit, how Her Majesty had insisted on teaching George the proper way to cast a fishing line, her patience endless as the young boy struggled with the technique. William was silent beside her, his jaw clenched in that way she had come to recognize when he was fighting to maintain control. His relationship with his grandmother had been complex, deepened by shared loss and mutual understanding of duty. The Queen had been there for him during the darkest period of his life, after his mother's death, providing stability when his world had crumbled. As they arrived at Balmoral, the sight of other family members already gathered told them everything they needed to know. Charles emerged from the castle, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. He embraced his son wordlessly, and, in that moment, William felt the full weight of what was coming. Soon his father would be king, and he would be heir to a throne that suddenly felt heavier than ever. The Queen's bedroom was peaceful, filled with soft light from the windows that looked out over the estate she loved so much. She lay propped against pillows, her breathing shallow but steady, surrounded by photographs of her family and her beloved corgis. When she opened her eyes and saw William and Catherine approaching, a small smile crossed her lips. "My dear boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but still carrying that familiar warmth. William took her hand, surprised by how small and fragile it felt. This was the woman who had ruled for 70 years, who had been the steady presence through countless storms, and now she seemed almost ethereal. Catherine hung back slightly, understanding this was a moment between grandmother and grandson, but the Queen's eyes found hers too. "Come closer, my dear," Elizabeth said, and Catherine approached, tears already beginning to fall. The Queen had welcomed her into the family with such grace, had become not just a sovereign to serve, but a cherished grandmother figure. They stayed with her through the morning, taking turns holding her hand, sharing quiet words and comfortable silences. The Queen spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of 7 decades of wisdom and love. She told William how proud she was of the man he had become, of the family he had built, of the way he had honored his duty while finding his own path. To Catherine, she spoke of the challenges ahead, of the strength she had seen in her from the very beginning. "You have the heart for this," the Queen said, her eyes still sharp despite her weakening state. "You understand what it means to serve, not just the crown, but the people. That understanding will guide you when the path seems unclear." As the afternoon wore on, other family members came and went, each spending precious moments with the woman who had been the cornerstone of their lives. William and Catherine remained constant, unwilling to leave her side. They had lunch brought to them, though neither could manage more than a few bites. The Queen dozed periodically, her breathing growing more labored with each passing hour. During one of these quiet moments, William found himself thinking about his children. George, Charlotte, and Louis were at school, unaware that their great-grandmother was slipping away. They adored her, and the thought of explaining her absence to them felt overwhelming. Catherine seemed to read his thoughts. "We'll find the right words," she said softly. "We'll help them understand that she lived a life of service and love, and that her legacy lives on in all of us." As evening approached, the family gathered once more around the Queen's bed. Charles held one hand while William held the other, and Andrew and Edward stood nearby with their own families. The room was filled with love and respect, a fitting atmosphere for someone who had given her entire life to others. The Queen opened her eyes one last time, looking around at the faces surrounding her. Her gaze lingered on each person, as if memorizing this final moment. When her eyes met William's, she squeezed his hand with surprising strength. "Take care of each other," she whispered, her words meant for all of them, but seeming especially directed at the next generation who would carry on her work. At 6:30 p.m. on September 8th, Queen Elizabeth II passed away peacefully, surrounded by the family she had loved and guided through decades of change and challenge. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by quiet sobs and whispered prayers. William felt the moment like a physical blow. The woman who had been a constant in his life since birth was gone. The Queen who had guided the nation through war and peace, triumph and tragedy, had finished her remarkable journey. But even as grief overwhelmed him, he felt something else, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. Catherine moved closer to him, her own tears falling freely now. They held each other as the reality began to sink in. Their lives had just changed forever. The woman who had been their anchor was gone, but her legacy, her lessons, her love would live on through them. The next hours passed in a blur of necessary protocols and arrangements. The Queen's private secretary made the official calls, setting in motion the carefully planned procedures that would transform a moment of private grief into a public farewell. But for now, in these first hours, the family was allowed their sorrow. William stood at the window of the Queen's sitting room later that evening, looking out at the darkening Scottish landscape. Catherine joined him, slipping her hand into his. They didn't speak. There was too much to say, and somehow no words adequate for the magnitude of what they had lost and what lay ahead. Tomorrow, the world would know. Tomorrow, the formal mourning would begin, and with it, their new roles as senior members of a family forever changed. But tonight, they simply grieved for the remarkable woman who had shaped their lives and their nation with such grace and dignity. The children would need to be told in the morning, a conversation that would mark the end of their childhood innocence in many ways. George, as future king, would begin to understand the weight of his destiny. Charlotte and Louis would learn that even the strongest people eventually say goodbye. But they would also learn about legacy, about a life lived in service to others, about the courage to carry on even when your heart is breaking. These lessons, taught through tears and memory, would become part of who they were, just as the Queen's lessons had shaped William and would now guide him through the most challenging period of his life. As the stars appeared over Balmoral, William and Catherine made their way back to their room, holding each other close. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new challenges, and new ways of serving their country. But tonight, they mourned together, finding strength in their shared love and their shared commitment to honoring the extraordinary woman who had just left them. The Queen was gone, but her spirit, her dedication, her love for her people would live on through those she had so carefully prepared to carry on her work. In their grief, William and Catherine could feel the beginning of something new, something that would honor Elizabeth's memory while meeting the needs of a changing world. The long journey toward farewell had begun, but so too had the journey toward a future shaped by the lessons of love, duty, and service that the Queen had spent her lifetime teaching them all. The morning after brought no relief from the weight of reality. William woke before dawn, the events of the previous day crashing over him like a cold wave. Beside him, Catherine stirred, her face still marked by the exhaustion of grief. Neither had slept well, their dreams filled with memories and the overwhelming sense that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The official announcement would be made at noon, but already the machinery of state was in motion. William's private secretary had been fielding calls since dawn, coordinating with Buckingham Palace, Downing Street, and the numerous organizations that would play a role in the days ahead. The careful choreography of royal protocol, planned for decades, was now unfolding with precision born of necessity. Catherine found William in the bathroom, staring at his reflection in the mirror as if seeing a stranger. "I keep expecting to wake up," he said quietly, "to find out this was all some terrible dream." She moved behind him, her arms encircling his waist. In the mirror, they looked older somehow, marked by the events of yesterday in ways that went beyond mere exhaustion. "The children," Catherine said, voicing what they were both thinking. "We need to tell them before they hear it from someone else." The drive back to London felt surreal. The world outside their car windows looked exactly as it had 2 days ago, but everything had fundamentally changed. People were going about their ordinary lives, unaware that their longest reigning monarch had passed away, unaware that history had turned a corner while they slept. George, Charlotte, and Louis were waiting at Kensington Palace, having spent the night with their nanny. At 9, 7, and 4 respectively, they understood that something serious was happening. Their parents had left suddenly for Scotland, and the adults around them had been speaking in hushed, worried tones. William and Catherine gathered their children in the sitting room, the same space where they had shared countless family moments, read bedtime stories, and celebrated birthdays. Now it would be the place where their children learned about loss in the most profound way. George sat straight-backed, his young face serious as he sensed the gravity of the moment. Charlotte pressed close to her mother, while Louis climbed into his father's lap, seeking comfort even before understanding why it was needed. "Your great-grandmother was very sick," William began, his voice carefully controlled. "Yesterday, she died peacefully at Balmoral, surrounded by people who loved her very much." The silence that followed was heavy with confusion and dawning understanding. Charlotte spoke first, her voice small. "Does that mean we won't see Gone anymore?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears at their pet name for the Queen, but she kept her voice steady. "No, sweetheart, but we'll always have our memories of her, and she'll always be part of our hearts." George, ever the thoughtful one, asked the question they had been dreading. "Does that mean Grandpa Charles is king now? And, Papa, does that mean you're—" He trailed off, not quite ready to voice the enormity of what his future held. "Yes," William said gently. "Grandpa is now King Charles III, and one day, a very long time from now, I will be king. And even longer after that, you'll have that responsibility too, George." The weight of legacy settled over the room. Louis, too young to fully understand, sensed the sadness and began to cry. Charlotte wrapped her arms around her little brother while George sat quietly, processing information that would reshape his understanding of his place in the world. They spent the morning together as a family, looking through photo albums and sharing memories of the Queen. Catherine told them about their great-grandmother's love of horses and her famous corgis. William shared stories of fishing with her at Balmoral and how she had taught him to tie his own shoes during a visit to Windsor. At 11:30, the family gathered around the television in their private sitting room. The BBC had interrupted regular programming, and the familiar voice of the announcer filled the room with formal gravity. Following the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, the Prince of Wales has now acceded to the throne and will be known as King Charles III. The words made it real in a way that nothing else had. William felt Catherine's hand find his, their children pressed close between them. George watched with wide eyes, beginning to understand the magnitude of change that had just swept through their lives. The phone began ringing almost immediately. Palace staff, government officials, family members, and foreign dignitaries all needed to coordinate the complex arrangements that lay ahead. But William and Catherine had decided that this first day would belong to their family, to processing their grief and beginning to help their children understand their new reality. By afternoon, flowers were already beginning to appear at the gates of Buckingham Palace. News crews had set up their equipment, and crowds were starting to gather. The outpouring of public emotion was immediate and overwhelming. Catherine watched the coverage with amazement at how quickly the nation had come together in shared mourning. She touched so many lives, Catherine said, watching as people of all ages placed flowers and left handwritten notes. Look at them all. She was their constant, their North Star for so long. William nodded, feeling the full weight of the role he would one day inherit. These people would look to him and his family for stability, for continuity, for leadership in times of uncertainty. It was a responsibility that had been theoretical until now, but watching the crowds made it viscerally real. The afternoon brought their first official duty as the new Prince and Princess of Wales, though the titles felt strange and weighty. They were needed at Buckingham Palace to meet with senior staff and begin planning for the days ahead. The children would stay with their nanny, but not before more tears and reassurances that Mama and Papa would be home for dinner. Buckingham Palace felt different as they arrived. Staff moved with quiet efficiency, black armbands already in place, the flag flying at half-mast. This had been the Queen's London home for 70 years, and her absence seemed to echo through the corridors. They met first with the new king, William's father, who looked older than his years, but was already settling into his new role with the gravity it demanded. The conversation was both deeply personal and profoundly official. They discussed the funeral arrangements, the period of mourning, and the logistics of the days ahead. "The next 2 weeks will test us all," Charles said, his voice carrying the weight of kingship. "The world will be watching, but more importantly, our people need to see us united, strong, and worthy of the trust she placed in us." The meeting room filled with advisors, secretaries, and protocol officers as they began planning what would become one of the largest state occasions in British history. World leaders would attend, millions would watch, and every detail would need to be perfect as a tribute to the woman who had defined an era. Catherine found herself taking notes, asking questions, and gradually stepping into her new role as the Princess of Wales. The title came with expectations, with duties, with a level of public scrutiny that was both thrilling and terrifying. She thought of Diana, of the weight that title had carried, and of her own determination to honor both the memory of the Queen and William's mother in how she carried it forward. As evening fell, they returned to Kensington Palace exhausted, but with a clearer sense of the path ahead. The next few days would be a whirlwind of preparation, of meetings with officials from around the world, of coordinating with security services and broadcasters and the hundreds of organizations involved in staging a state funeral. Dinner with the children was a welcome return to normalcy, though the conversation inevitably returned to their great-grandmother. Lewis had drawn a picture of her with her corgis, his 4-year-old interpretation capturing her spirit, if not her likeness. Charlotte had written a letter she wanted to include with the flowers they would place, her careful handwriting expressing love and gratitude. George remained thoughtful, asking questions about what would happen next, about the funeral, about their new roles. His questions were intelligent and showed a maturity beyond his years, but they also reminded William and Catherine how much their son's childhood was about to change. After the children were in bed, William and Catherine sat together in their private sitting room, the weight of the day settling over them. The television showed continuous coverage of the crowds outside royal residences, the tributes pouring in from around the world, the beginning of what would be a global outpouring of grief and respect. "Are we ready for this?" Catherine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William considered the question seriously. "I don't think anyone can be ready for this. But we have each other, we have the children, and we have her example. She showed us how to serve, how to put duty before personal preference, how to find strength even in the darkest moments." They watched as footage played of some of the Queen's most memorable moments. Her coronation as a young woman, her golden and diamond jubilee celebrations, her steady presence during national crises, her joy at family celebrations. Each image was a reminder of the standard they were now called to uphold. The phone rang again, bringing news of arrangements being finalized, of international leaders confirming their attendance, of the logistical challenges of securing London for what might be the largest gathering of world leaders in history. Each conversation was a reminder that this was bigger than their personal grief, that they were now responsible for helping a nation and a commonwealth say goodbye to the only monarch most people had ever known. As they prepared for bed, Catherine found William standing at the window, looking out at the lights of London. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Tomorrow we start meeting people," he said. "People who are grieving, people who want to share their memories, people who need to see that we're going to carry on our work. I keep thinking about what she would want us to say, how she would want us to comfort them." Catherine joined him at the window. "We'll find the right words. We'll be ourselves, be honest about our own grief, and let people know that her legacy lives on through all of us." In the distance, they could see crowds still gathered outside Buckingham Palace, their flowers and candles creating a sea of light and color. It was a reminder that grief was easier to bear when shared, that the nation was mourning together, and that somehow, in coming together, they would find the strength to say goodbye to their beloved queen while preparing to welcome a new chapter in their shared history. The long night ahead would bring little sleep, but tomorrow would bring the opportunity to begin showing the nation that while their queen was gone, her values, her dedication, and her love for her people would continue through those she had so carefully prepared to carry on her work. The sound of rain against the windows of Windsor Castle created a melancholy soundtrack to the morning as William and Catherine prepared for one of their most challenging days yet. 3 days had passed since the Queen's death, and today they would meet with members of the public who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. The queue of people waiting to see the Queen lying in state stretched for miles through London, a testament to the love and respect she had commanded. Catherine adjusted her black dress in the mirror, her hands trembling slightly. She had worn black for days now, as had the entire royal family, but somehow it never felt routine. Each morning brought the fresh reality of loss, the weight of grief that seemed to settle a little deeper into her bones. William appeared behind her in the reflection, his own formal attire making him look older, more serious than she had ever seen him. The children asked if they could come today, he said quietly. "Charlotte wants to lay flowers with the other children, and George thinks he should be there because he's going to be king someday." Catherine turned to face him, seeing her own mixture of pride and concern reflected in his eyes. "They're so young to be dealing with all of this. But maybe that's not entirely wrong. They're part of this family, part of this moment in history." The decision had been made that the children would join them for a brief public appearance, carefully managed to allow them to participate while protecting them from the overwhelming nature of the crowds and media attention. It was a delicate balance, honoring their desire to say goodbye to their great-grandmother while preserving what remained of their childhood. The drive to Windsor Great Park was somber, the countryside still shrouded in the early morning mist. Catherine watched the landscape pass by, remembering countless family gatherings at Windsor, the Queen's obvious love for this place, and the children's delight in exploring the vast grounds during visits. George sat quietly in his formal black suit, his young face serious as he processed the gravity of the day. Charlotte held a small bouquet of flowers they had picked from the gardens at Kensington Palace, her choice to include some of the Queen's favorite white roses. Louis, still too young to fully understand the formality required, had been coached on the importance of staying close to Mama and Papa. As they arrived at the castle, Catherine was struck by the sight of thousands of people gathered outside the gates. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, people of every background and from every corner of the kingdom. Many had been waiting since dawn. Some had traveled overnight from Scotland or Wales, all united in their desire to pay their final respects to their queen. "Look at them all," William said softly, his voice filled with awe. She really was the mother of the nation, wasn't she? The family's first stop was at the floral tributes that had grown into a stunning carpet of color and memory. Thousands upon thousands of flowers, cards, photographs, and personal mementos created a living memorial that stretched as far as the eye could see. Catherine had to pause for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of love and grief on display. George stepped forward with his own flowers, a simple arrangement he had insisted on making himself. His small hands shook slightly as he placed them among the thousands of others, his young mind clearly trying to process the magnitude of the moment. Charlotte followed, her bouquet joined by a handwritten note that simply said, "Thank you for being the best great-grandmother in the world." The crowd respectfully maintained distance, but Catherine could see phones recording the moment, capturing this glimpse of the royal children saying their own goodbye. She felt protective and proud simultaneously, watching her children participate in this historic moment with such dignity and grace. Their next task was perhaps more challenging, meeting with members of the public who had been selected from the long queue of mourners. These were people who had waited hours, sometimes days, for their chance to pay respects, and now they would have a few precious minutes to share their memories and receive comfort from the royal family. The first family they met was from Cornwall, an elderly couple who had driven through the night to be here. The woman clutched a photograph of herself meeting the Queen during a visit to her village 30 years earlier, her eyes bright with unshed tears as she told Catherine about that day. "She remembered our conversation when she returned 5 years later," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She asked about my grandson, who had been ill. Can you imagine?" With all the people she met, she remembered one conversation with one woman in one small village. Catherine felt her own eyes fill with tears as she listened to story after story of the Queen's kindness, her attention to detail, her genuine interest in the lives of ordinary people. Each encounter reinforced what the family knew. Elizabeth II had been not just a monarch, but a grandmother figure to an entire nation. William spoke with a group of military veterans, men and women who had served during various conflicts throughout the Queen's reign. Their stories were of a commander-in-chief who truly understood service, who had honored their sacrifices and never forgotten their contributions. One elderly man, tears streaming down his face, told William how the Queen had personally written to his wife after he was injured in the Falklands. "She didn't have to do that," he said, "but she did because she cared. She really cared about all of us." The children handled their interactions with remarkable composure. George listened intently as people shared their memories, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that showed his growing understanding of his great-grandmother's impact. Charlotte offered shy smiles and accepted the many condolences with grace beyond her years. Even Louis, when introduced to other children in the crowd, managed his formal handshakes with endearing seriousness. As the morning progressed, Catherine found herself drawing strength from these encounters. Each person they met reinforced the importance of what they were doing, not just the formal protocols of mourning, but the human connection, the shared grief that bound the nation together. These people needed to see that the royal family was grieving too, that the Queen's death was a personal loss for them, as well as an official one. One particularly moving encounter was with a group of children from a local school, all carrying drawings and letters for the Queen. Their teacher explained that they had been working on a project about the monarch when the news broke, and the children had insisted on finishing their tributes. Catherine knelt to their level as they presented their artwork, each piece showing the Queen with her corgis, her horses, or wearing her crown. Their innocent questions about where the Queen had gone and whether she was happy touched Catherine's heart and reminded her of the conversations they would continue to have with their own children. "Will you still be a princess now that the Queen is gone?" one little girl asked with a directness that only children possess. "Yes," Catherine answered gently. "I'll always be a princess, but now I'm the Princess of Wales. That means I have new jobs to do, new ways to help people, just like the Queen taught us." The afternoon brought meetings with officials and dignitaries, but also with representatives from the many charities and organizations the Queen had supported throughout her reign. These encounters showed another side of the monarch's impact, her role as patron and supporter of causes ranging from animal welfare to education to healthcare. Catherine found herself particularly moved by her meeting with representatives from children's charities, organizations the Queen had supported quietly for decades. Their stories of her private visits, her genuine interest in their work, and her hands-on involvement in fundraising efforts painted a picture of someone who used her position not for personal glory, but to make real differences in real lives. As the day wore on, William and Catherine began to understand more fully the scope of the task ahead of them. They would need to maintain relationships with hundreds of organizations, support thousands of charities, and somehow fill the enormous space the Queen's passing had left in the lives of millions of people. "It feels impossible," Catherine admitted quietly to William during a brief break between meetings. "How do you replace someone who is everything to so many people?" "You don't replace her," William replied, his voice thoughtful. "You honor her by being yourself, by bringing your own gifts to the role, by caring as much as she did, even if you do it differently." The final event of the day was perhaps the most emotional, a visit to the staff quarters at Windsor, where they met with the people who had worked alongside the Queen for decades. These were the individuals who had seen her daily, who had shared in her private moments as well as her public duties, who had lost not just a sovereign but an employer, colleague, and friend. The stories shared by footmen who had served her morning tea for 30 years, by ladies-in-waiting who had accompanied her on countless engagements, by gardeners who had maintained her beloved flower beds, painted a picture of a woman who was demanding but fair, formal but kind, distant but deeply caring about those who served her. "She knew all of our names," said one housekeeper who had worked at the castle for 4 decades. "All of our birthdays, our children's names, our worries and joys. She wasn't just our queen, she was part of our family." As evening fell and they prepared to return to London, Catherine found herself emotionally drained but somehow strengthened. The day had been difficult, filled with tears and grief, but also with love and connection. They had seen firsthand the impact of a life lived in service to others, and they had begun to understand their own roles in carrying that legacy forward. The children were quiet on the drive back, processing their own version of the day's events. George asked thoughtful questions about the people they had met, showing an early understanding of the responsibilities that would one day be his. Charlotte talked about the flowers and the drawings, about how much love people had for Gone. Louis simply fell asleep, exhausted by the emotional weight of a day beyond his years. That evening, as they tucked the children into bed, Catherine reflected on how much they had all grown in just a few short days. The children were beginning to understand their place in something larger than themselves, while she and William were discovering strengths they didn't know they possessed. "Today felt different," William said as they finally sat down together in their private sitting room. "More real somehow. Seeing all those people, hearing their stories, understanding what she meant to them." Catherine nodded, thinking of the faces they had encountered, the stories they had heard, the love they had witnessed. "Tomorrow we start planning the funeral. All those world leaders, all that protocol, all that formality. But today felt like what really matters. The people, the connections, the love she inspired." Outside their windows, London continued its vigil. The crowds had not diminished. If anything, they had grown larger as word spread of the royal family's appearances. People wanted to be part of this moment, to share their grief and their memories, to be part of saying goodbye to the only monarch most of them had ever known. As they prepared for bed, both William and Catherine felt the weight of the days ahead. The funeral would be watched by billions, attended by the most powerful people in the world, and would need to be a fitting tribute to 7 decades of service. But today had reminded them that beyond all the pomp and ceremony, this was about love, about family, about a nation mourning together and finding strength in shared grief and shared purpose. The Queen was gone, but her lessons lived on in every person they had met. every story they had heard, every tear that had been shed in her memory. And in carrying on her work, in serving the people who had loved her so deeply, William and Catherine would ensure that her legacy continued to touch lives for generations to come. The morning of the funeral dawned crisp and clear, as if the heavens themselves had cleared to honor the passing of Queen Elizabeth II. Catherine stood at the window of their suite at Buckingham Palace, watching as the final preparations took place in the courtyard below. Military personnel moved with precision, their movements choreographed down to the second, while security teams conducted final sweeps of the route that would carry their beloved queen to her final rest. William emerged from the bathroom, already dressed in his ceremonial military uniform, the weight of medals and honors creating a formal silhouette that made Catherine's breath catch. In 10 years of marriage, she had seen him in formal attire countless times, but never for an occasion quite like this. Today, he looked every inch the future king, bearing the responsibility that would one day be fully his. "The children are awake," he said quietly, his voice carrying the strain of the past week. "George is asking questions about the ceremony. Charlotte wants to know if she'll be able to see everything, and Louis is worried about staying quiet for so long." Catherine nodded, her own nerves evident in the careful way she adjusted her black dress and checked her appearance one final time. The outfit had been chosen weeks ago, when the Queen's declining health had made this day feel inevitable, but she had hoped never to wear it. The black coat dress was elegant but understated, appropriate for a day that belonged entirely to honoring Elizabeth II. They made their way to the children's rooms, finding George already fully dressed and standing at attention, his young face serious as he practiced the formal behavior expected of him. Charlotte was having her hair finished by one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting, while Louis was being helped into his formal suit by his nanny, his 4-year-old energy barely contained by the solemnity of the occasion. "Remember what we discussed," William said gently to his children. "Today is about saying goodbye to Gone and showing the world how much we loved her. People will be watching, but more importantly, we're here because we want to honor her memory." George nodded seriously, his understanding of the day's significance evident in his careful attention to every detail of his appearance. At 9, he was old enough to grasp the historical importance of what was happening, old enough to understand that this would be remembered long after he became king himself. Charlotte, ever sensitive to emotions, asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. "Will it hurt too much to watch them take her away?" Catherine knelt to her daughter's level, her own eyes bright with unshed tears. "It will be sad, sweetheart. It's okay to cry if you need to. But we'll also remember all the happy times we had with her, all the ways she loved us, and all the good things she did for people all over the world." The family breakfast was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts and preparations. The children ate little, their nervous energy evident in the way they fidgeted with their napkins and asked repeated questions about the day ahead. Catherine and William managed only coffee, their stomachs too tight with emotion and responsibility to manage much else. At 8:30, the first guests began arriving at Westminster Abbey. Catherine watched on television as presidents and prime ministers, kings and queens, and representatives from every corner of the globe took their places in the ancient church. The sight was both overwhelming and deeply moving, the entire world coming together to honor one remarkable woman. 2,000 people, William said, reading from the final guest list. And somehow it still doesn't feel like enough to properly say goodbye. The children were brought to the window to see the crowds gathering along the funeral route. Hundreds of thousands of people had claimed their spots since dawn, many having camped overnight to secure the best views. The sight of so many people, all united in grief and respect, made even Louis understand that this was something extraordinary. "Look at all the people who loved her," Charlotte said softly, her young voice filled with wonder. At 10:15, it was time to leave for Westminster Abbey. The family gathered in the grand entrance of Buckingham Palace, where they would join the formal procession that would carry the Queen on her final journey. Catherine felt her composure wavering as she saw the gun carriage waiting outside, the Queen's coffin draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown. William must have sensed her emotion, because his hand found hers, squeezing gently. Together, he whispered, the single word carrying all the weight of their shared commitment to getting through this day with dignity and grace. The walk to Westminster Abbey felt both eternal and far too short. The children handled the formality with remarkable composure, their small hands held firmly by their parents as they processed behind the Queen's coffin. The silence of the crowds was profound, broken only by the sound of military bands and the steady rhythm of footsteps on ancient stones. Catherine found herself thinking about the last conversation she had with the Queen just days before her death. They had talked about the children, about their future responsibilities, about the importance of maintaining family bonds even under the pressure of public duty. The Queen's voice had been weak, but her wisdom had been as sharp as ever. The crown changes everything, she had said, but never let it change who you are inside. The people need to see your humanity, the genuine care for them. That's what makes the monarchy relevant in the modern world. As they entered Westminster Abbey, Catherine was struck by the majesty of the moment. The ancient stones seemed to absorb the emotion of the congregation, the weight of history and tradition creating an atmosphere unlike anything she had ever experienced. 2,000 of the most powerful people in the world sat in reverent silence, all united in their respect for the woman they had come to honor. The service itself was both deeply personal and magnificently formal. The Archbishop of Canterbury spoke of the Queen's faith, her service, and her unwavering commitment to her people. The hymns echoed through the abbey with voices raised in shared emotion, while the prayers offered comfort to a nation in mourning. Catherine watched her children throughout the service, marveling at their composure while staying alert for any signs that the emotion was becoming too much. George sat straight-backed, following along with the order of service and clearly understanding the significance of each element. Charlotte leaned against her mother during the more emotional moments, while Louis managed to stay quiet with occasional gentle redirections from his father. The moment that nearly broke Catherine's composure came during the reading from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. The words seemed to capture perfectly the bittersweet nature of the day, grief for what was lost, but gratitude for a life so fully lived in service to others. Catherine thought about the Queen's final years, the way she had continued her duties almost until the very end, the grace with which she had prepared her family for this transition. As the service concluded with the last post and reveille, Catherine felt a shift in the atmosphere of the abbey. The formal farewell was complete, but somehow this felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. The Queen's work was finished, but theirs was just beginning. The procession to Wellington Arch was even more emotional than the morning's journey. Now the crowd were openly weeping, throwing flowers, and calling out their love for the Queen one final time. Catherine could see people of all ages, from elderly veterans to young children, all united in their desire to say goodbye. At Wellington Arch, the family gathered for the final transfer of the Queen's coffin to the hearse that would carry her to Windsor for the private burial. This was the moment Catherine had been dreading, the final goodbye, the moment when they would watch her disappear from their lives forever. As the coffin was loaded into the hearse, George surprised everyone by stepping forward and bowing formally, his young body expressing the respect and love he felt for his great-grandmother. Charlotte followed suit with a perfect curtsy, while Louis managed a solemn bow with his father's guidance. The gesture was spontaneous and deeply moving, a final tribute from the next generation to the woman who had shaped their understanding of duty and service. The drive to Windsor was quiet, each family member lost in their own thoughts and memories. Catherine watched the countryside pass by, thinking about all the times they had made this journey for family gatherings, how excited the children had always been to see their great-grandmother, how she had always made time for them despite her busy schedule. The private burial service at St. George's Chapel was intimate and peaceful, attended only by close family members. After the public pageantry of the morning, this felt like the goodbye they had all needed: personal, quiet, and focused on their relationships rather than their roles. As they laid the Queen to rest beside Prince Philip, Catherine felt a sense of completion. The woman who had defined an era was now at peace, reunited with the man she had loved for more than 70 years. The grief would continue, but there was also a sense of gratitude for having been part of her remarkable life. The family returned to Windsor Castle for a private dinner, the first meal they had shared together since the Queen's death that wasn't overshadowed by protocol and public duties. The children's energy returned as the formality of the day ended, and they spent the evening sharing their favorite memories of their great-grandmother. George talked about the fishing lessons at Balmoral. Charlotte remembered the tea parties in the Queen's sitting room, and Louis, though his memories were fewer, spoke about how she had always had sweets in her handbag just for him. Each memory was precious, a reminder of the woman behind the crown. As they prepared to return to London that evening, Catherine and William took a moment to walk through the gardens at Windsor, the place where the Queen had been happiest. The September air was cool and crisp, filled with the scents of late summer flowers that the Queen had loved so much. "She's really gone," William said softly, the reality finally beginning to sink in after a day focused on ceremony and duty. "But look at what she left behind," Catherine replied, gesturing toward the castle where their children were saying their final goodbyes to staff members who had known the Queen for decades. "Look at the love, the respect, the example she set. That doesn't die with her." As they drove back to London, the children asleep in the car, Catherine reflected on the extraordinary day they had just experienced. They had said goodbye to their beloved Queen, but they had also seen the beginning of their own future, the roles they would play in carrying on her legacy. The road ahead would be challenging. There would be new responsibilities, new expectations, new ways of serving their country and the Commonwealth. But today had shown them something important. They were not alone in this journey. They had each other, they had their children, and they had the love and support of millions of people who understood the importance of what they were trying to do. The Queen was gone, but her spirit, her values, and her dedication to service lived on in all of them. In the days and years to come, William and Catherine would draw on the lessons she had taught them, the example she had set, and the love she had shown them as they worked to be worthy successors to her remarkable legacy. The funeral was over, the goodbye had been said, but the work of honoring Elizabeth II through their own service to others was just beginning. And in that work, in that commitment to something larger than themselves, they would ensure that her memory and her impact on the world would continue for generations to come.